food shortages are not something that celebrities normally experience,
No.
but perhaps going forward, you and I will. And that might sound a bit dramatic. And yes, we brought out the most dramatic and inflammatory site that we can bring out to talk about this stuff. Let's have a look at some extracts from Breitbart. Okay. White House warns of global food shortages after Ukraine invasion. Well, it's pretty obvious, but there we go. The White House confirmed Monday they expect certain parts of the world to suffer a food shortage as an effect of Russian President Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Quote, "We do anticipate that higher energy, fertilizer, wheat and corn prices could impact the price of growing and purchasing critical food supplies for countries around the world," White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said Monday. She said food shortages were not expected to hit the United States, but rather countries in Africa, the Middle East and Southeast Asia. Okay, well, it's Breitbart, but it's Jen Psaki as well. So let's remind ourselves that Russia, Ukraine and Belarus are reasonably important for the world's food economy.
Yeah.
So let's go to another far-right news outlet, the Financial Times. This is from 2 weeks ago, but the economic fundamentals remain the same. Food crisis looms as Ukrainian wheat shipments grind to a halt. Russia and Ukraine supply almost a third of the world's wheat exports, and since the Russian assault on its neighbour, ports on the Black Sea have come to a virtual standstill. As a result, wheat prices have soared to record highs, overtaking levels seen during the food crisis of 2007-2008. If farmers in Ukraine don't start planting anytime soon, there will be a huge crisis to food security. If Ukraine's food production falls in the coming season, the wheat price could double or triple, said a Dutch national who they interviewed for this story. He has been farming for 2 decades in Cherkasy, 200 kilometers south of Kiev. He's part of a farming union whose 1,100 members cover just under 10% of the country's farmland. Which is curious, actually, because that's a very small number of people and a very large amount of land.
It is, isn't it?
It is. Now, I have heard rumours through the grapevine from way back in the day of some rather shady practices going on in East Ukraine regarding the buying up of ethnic Russian farmland by large conglomerates and being sold off to Western farmers who occupy large amounts of land, obviously. I can't verify these at the moment, of course, but I think that's part of the large and increasingly intricate puzzle of dodgy dealing that surrounds Ukraine.
Quite.
The surge in prices, he continues, will fuel soaring food inflation, already at a 7-year high of 7.8% in January, and the biggest impact will be on the food security of poorer grain importers, warned analysts and food aid organizations. Ukraine accounts for 90% of Lebanon's wheat imports.
Goodness.
And is a leading supplier for countries including Somalia, Syria, and Libya. So all basically enemies of the West as far as the US is concerned.
Yeah.
Lebanon is really struggling with an already high import bill, and this is only going to make things worse, said James Swanston, emerging market economist at Capital Economics.
So if these are all enemies of the West, why does the US care enough to declare this as an international problem?
Well, I don't think they necessarily do care. That's the thing. I think it's rather blasé of Psaki to come out and say, well, there'll be food shortages, but it's only in the rest of the world. We'll be fine. That's kind of the vibe I get from the White House at the moment.
Yeah, I suppose it's not inaccurate.
And there is the question as well, prices will go up in America, but I'm Jen Psaki, look at my salary. Do you think I care about the price of fish? There's kind of that vibe that I get out of these announcements.
Yeah, I can see that.
It's a poor person's problem. Russia also provides its Black Sea neighbour Turkey with more than 70% of its wheat imports, according to the International Trade Center. Even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, inflation in Turkey had hit a 20-year high of 54.4% in February, as we'd covered. The war is only going to exacerbate the cost of food, said Ismail Kemaloglu, the former head of the state Turkish Grain Board and now the director of the consultancy IK.
See, that's pretty concerning for NATO, because Turkey have been, despite the fact that their kind of relationship with their NATO allies is somewhat fractured, particularly with Greece, who are in NATO as well, aren't they? Given that dependent on wheat imports, at what point are they going to start thinking, I don't know, Turkey first?
Well, Turkey have been playing a very clever game, as usual, between NATO and Russia. And Turkey, for example, they've not closed their airspace to Russian planes and so on. They still, I believe, have a visa-free regime with Russia, so there have been many people paying a fortune to get on the last flights to Turkey. They are hosting Russian diplomats, and I believe they're hosting the main high-level negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, though I may be mistaken on that. And basically, crafty old Erdogan seems to be playing both sides. He's recently gave a speech announcing that the Turkish economy was actually seeing a boom in, for example, its tourism sector as a result of Russians.
Oh, really?
And so on and so forth. So I think if there are going to be any economic winners out of this, at least in the short term, Turkey might be one of them, as one of the only NATO countries that's been able to not sanction Russia. So there we go. We'll see how long that lasts. There's also the fact that many of the private yachts which have been seized by the EU and Britain and so on, the ones which have escaped these confiscations have all gone and parked up in Turkey.
I wonder why.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
I know, geopolitics
Is that where Mr. Abramovich is now?
Yeah. Now, there is still a danger in that the main route for importing grain into Turkey from Russia is via the Black Sea, which is obviously an active war zone at the moment.
Yeah.
But we'll have to watch that.
Didn't Turkey consistently close that off to the Russian Navy?
No, they closed the Bosphorus to all shipping, but they are not allowed to close the straits to returning fleets because that would be an act of war.
Of course.
So it doesn't really affect Russia.
Yeah, they'd be crossing NATO's own obligations.
Exactly. So the last time wheat prices spiked to these levels in 2007 and 2008 because of severe production declines in leading producing countries such as Australia and Russia, protests spread through nearly 40 countries, from Haiti to the Ivory Coast. While the jump in grain prices in 2009-2010 is regarded as one of the triggers of the Arab Spring uprisings in the Middle East. Yeah, I still hate that term Arab Spring, by the way, because it was anything but a spring for Syria and Libya in particular. And Yemen, too, is still a bloodbath. So the places where it succeeded, you could say perhaps Tunisia.
Egypt.
Egypt, yeah. But Arab Spring was always a propaganda term, and the more we use it, the more it sounds like one.
Maybe we should stop using it.
Yeah, but I think the CIA-backed wave of Arab state coups and rebellions doesn't have quite such a ring to it.
No, it doesn't. You're quite right.
And we'll get people raging at me in the comments, but there we go. But there's also, we've talked about crops a little bit, but Belarus produces, I think, 10% of the world's potash, which is used to produce fertilizer, and that in turn produces crops. And one thing people have been warning about for a long time, particularly in environmental circles, is fertilizer. Because as we try to produce more and more food, we obviously struggle to ramp up production of fertilizer to create that food.
Yes.
To grow it. This gives us a quick look of wheat production by country. That graphic isn't particularly illuminating, but if we scroll down, there's a nice graph there. John, if we can scroll down a bit. Here we go. So you can see right down at the bottom. What's that? Number 3? With 86 million tons of wheat production. That's Russia. Yep, second only to India and China. Ukraine also produced 26.2 million tons of wheat, 9th in the world. Between the two of them, they account for about 14.5% of global wheat production. And it must be remembered that because they have small populations relative to the amount of crops they're producing, they are net exporters of these crops. So other countries like India and China, obviously they produce more, but they also have massive populations that need feeding, so they export a lot less. So when we talk about exports, they disproportionately affect the global economy. And of course, the more of a surplus there is, the cheaper food prices are. The less of a surplus, the more expensive food is. Now, for comparison, the USA only produced 47.3 million tons, so almost half of what Russia produces. Let's have a look at barley, which is another crop. Russia is the world's largest producer, with 18 million tons produced per year. Ukraine is the world's 4th largest, producing 9.4 million tons of barley, and together they account for 16% of world production, so even more proportionally than wheat. Germany is the largest Western producer, for context, with 10.7 million tons. Now, proportional production of rice and corn is much lower than these principal crops, though still significant. But this is not really very good, I think. So let's just recap all of the economic pressures that we're likely to see in the developed Western world, even if we don't have problems with famines or anything like that. As access to these food markets is restricted and production is affected by war, we can absolutely expect significant price inflation when it comes to foodstuffs in the developed world. Added to the usual inflation from reckless money printing, extravagant public spending, billion-dollar foreign aid packages, and COVID recovery stimulus packages, the cost of food is also going to get quite significant.
Yeah.
And add that to the hike in energy prices caused, again, partly by Russian sanctions, we can expect the cost of living to become pretty severe over the next 2 years.
Yeah, well, without the Russian war, it was going to get to that, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was moving in that direction already, and this just nudged it all along, giving it a big jolt.
Oh, dearie me.
But we must consider... So, Josh and I recently did a contemplations on prepping, which you might be interested in. Not a scaremonger or anything like that, but I think it would be to everyone's benefit to have a few months of stocked food, tins, that sort of thing.
Yeah, we're of course not anticipating that something explosive is going to happen, but rather you might want to be a little bit more monetarily savvy for the
Absolutely.
foreseeable future as prepare for this extortionate hike in prices.
Yeah, and also if there were a shock like COVID, which caused a massive wave of panic buying, then you would actually be doing a public service by already keeping a stockpile of several months, because you wouldn't have to participate in that panic buying. And so you wouldn't take part in these long queues. You wouldn't be stripping toilet roll off the shelves and things like that, because you would already be fine. You would be being responsible and prudent and so on.
Building up an arsenal slowly, gradually, and without causing any disruption.
Arsenal is the wrong word,
Yes,
because that specifically applies to weapons, which we are not recommending.
Yeah.
It's illegal in most countries to be stockpiling weapons, and it's not. But stockpile food, I think it's very, very good as an idea.
An arsenal of food, I should have said.
What's the word for an arsenal of food? A pantry?
I've just created it.
And then, of course, we have to think about the non-developed countries. So when prices are high here, the situations could be really bad in the developing world. Could we see famines and food shortages?
Certainly, if it leads to more hoarding and more panic buying. And not just panic buying at an individual level, but at the governmental level where we start. I mean, you could say this is the natural result of nation states looking after themselves, but is this going to be kind of the renewal of a more kind of isolationist political climate, do you think?
I don't know. It's hard to tell, because equally there are many in the sort of international bureaucracy that runs the developed world who would very happily alleviate a famine in Ethiopia, even if it meant the starvation and misery of the people in Britain.
Oh, I know that for a fact.
Right.
Or as good as. Yes.
So I think that sentiment will likely predominate. However, if there are genuine rises in the price of food, then it will create civil unrest, I think, like we saw in the Arab Spring.
Yeah, well, if it caused unrests, like serious unrest, then what are we going to be faced with in the midst of this crisis?
It's true that the seeds of unrest have already were very well planted with 2 years of COVID lockdowns, which have definitely proved that the government is not your friend. In the words of the great Michael Jackson, they don't really care about us. In fact, they might be deliberately acting against our best interests at times.
How much do you think prices are going to rise then?
Well, how long is a piece of string?
Well, a loaf of, let's just say a loaf of bread at the moment costs about £1 or just over that.
There's so many factors that it would be irresponsible for me to speculate, I think. But we've already got inflation at about 7.5%, and maybe at as high as 9%, I think, in America.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, we're going to get inflation of especially food. And then depending on how severe the pinch is, that could be... I mean, this farmer was saying it could double or triple the fundamentals for food. So...
Goodness.
If that were the case, yeah, you could be realistically doubling or tripling your food budget over the next 2 or 3 years.
Of course, we're sanctioning Russia for reasons that everyone is familiar with. But what about Ukraine's ability to trade? I mean, the longer this war goes on, I mean, how productive is Ukraine at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely not at all. And
Not
that's
at
one
all.
of the major effects from this, is that as the war goes into March and now moving on into April, having missed the first planting season, that's going to massively dent Ukraine's agricultural production capacity, let alone all the fact they have to build up the entire country again after the war finishes.
Yeah.
And then again, if the peace settlement is made with Russia grabbing a load of Ukrainian land, then you can bet your bottom dollar there will be very little foreign development aid coming in to build that up.
Yes,
again.
and if Zelensky continues his no quarter position, you could say, but that is not his position. He has made some concessions
He has.
at the negotiating table. But let's just say he takes it to the point where Ukraine becomes a part of the Russian Federation.
Oof.
Where does that leave us?
Right. Yeah.
Because we've of course lost an entire trading partner.
Well, that would be
one of the most productive.
I don't think that would happen. And I think that if that did happen, the West would be busily engaged in essentially funneling weapons to start guerrilla uprisings against the Russians.
What, you mean they're not doing that already?
Well, they have been doing it for 8 years in
Yeah.
some manner of speech, but I don't think that's going to happen at all.
No. But it is nonetheless the most kind of black-pilled.
Well, it does pose an
Grim
interesting
conclusion.
question. And the question there is that suppose that were to happen, I don't think it will happen, then would our sanctions on Russia be justified, even though we're punishing the people that we put the sanctions on Russia to protect, but then we're putting it on because... But anyway, it's one of these intellectual hypothetical exercises that isn't very useful, I think.
If you appreciated that segment from the podcast The Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the premium content we have on the site, such as Carl's interview here with Calvin Robinson. And if you want to follow Calvin, you can always follow him on Getter at Calvin Robinson on Getter. Thank you and goodbye.